my name is Heejung Chung. I'm a senior lecturer in sociology and social policy at the University of Kent. I'm a labor sociologist, so what I'm interested in is the changes in the labor market, the changes in the nature of work, and to see how that has an impact on our daily lives. As a part of that, I've just recently received funding from the Economic Social Research Council to do a project called Work Autonomy, Flexibility, and Work-Life Balance. Now, what this project tries to do is to look at the increase of flexible working and how that has an impact on our working, but also our private lives. Before I talk about the project and the ideas and the future of flexible working, and to see whether flexible working is a way of the future, I'll just kind of talk briefly about how work has changed over the last century or two. Now, if you think about the agricultural economy, work was defined by nature, by the seasons, by the weather. So there are certain types of work that you did during the spring. You seeded, and then you harvested in the autumn. You went to work when it was sunny, and perhaps couldn't work when it was rainy. Now, with the introduction of industrialization, work has changed. Now we all worked in factories inside. And the rhythm of work was based on the rhythm of the machines. You were a part of the machine in a conveyor belt, where your work was a part of a group of workers which individually took part in the manufacturing of goods. Workers clocked in at the same times, they clocked out at the same time, and they even took breaks at the same time, which is what we call Taylorism, kind of the construction of work in that kind of structure. The interesting thing is people who weren't actually in the factories also worked in a similar manner. You get rows of the same offices, same desks, people all typing along in a very uniform manner, almost like the conveyor belt, but doing white-collar office jobs. But similar to the factories, you clocked in at the same time, you clocked out at the same time, and, well, to a lesser degree, but you took breaks at the same time, as if you were part of the office machine. Now, a lot has changed since then, especially due to the nature of work, the types of work we do, but perhaps more so to do with the change of technology. Technology has developed to a great extent in the past few decades, where increasingly your work doesn't have to be confined into a certain space. Your work isn't in a certain database that you could only access in the office, and you could connect to people through various means, including various mobile data services. And what we do see is that you don't confine your workspace into the office that you work in. You could work whenever you want and wherever you want. And if you think of Google, and I think a lot of us has the image of where or how Google workers work, is that they don't work in offices, they don't work in desks, they work whenever and wherever to kind of increase that creativity. And what managers have found out is that rather than confining workers into a specific place and a specific time of work, if you allow workers more discretion, more control over their work, you actually get better performance outcomes or better productivity. And because of that, what we see is that there has been an increase of people gaining that kind of autonomy over their working hours and working place. For example, if you look at the data of workers who have the ability to work from home, so out of the office, we see that approximately 1 out of 10 workers have been able to work from home at least once during the past 3 months. In addition, if you look at the control over your working hours, that has also increased as well. So approximately about 15+% of workers have freedom to change the starting and ending times of their work, and which also leads to the changing of the number of hours you work per day, per week, and maybe accumulating those hours to take days off. And in addition to that, approximately 5% of all workers across Europe have complete autonomy over their work. So that's kind of where you can work whenever you want and how long you want, really. Now, what does that mean for us, the workers? Now, on one hand, that's, the more control you have over your work means that you have more control to adapt your work to other spheres of life, and more importantly, your family life. Before workers had that kind of control, a lot of parents, especially mothers, had to drop out of the labor market because of the certain restrictions work had with the combination of family life. For example, school hours. If you had to pick your children up at 3 o'clock and you had to work at 5, you just couldn't manage to do the two. Now, if you have flexi time, so flexibility to start your work perhaps a bit early and then end it at 3 o'clock, you have the ability to do the school pickups, which really could improve work-life balance for parents. Also, working from home, previously, if your child was sick, you had to find someone else to take care of the child, or you had to just take an annual leave. Now, you might be able to combine working from home with the sick child, so you could do some work while the kid's in bed or while taking care of the child and kind of make up maybe perhaps later on in the evenings. All of that could really potentially increase work-life balance, right? The interesting thing is, however, we find that that is not necessarily the case. Having more autonomy or flexibility does not always lead to better work-life balance. Now, why is that? The reason for it is because although we assume that if you have more control of your working hours and where you work, that kind of workers might reduce their hours, reduce their intensity. But actually, the opposite is the case. We find that empirically, the more autonomy or more control you give workers, they tend to increase their working hours. People who telework, work from home, increase the number of hours they work. Now, this could be explained by various things. One was the gift exchange. Oh, because my employer was so kind to give me this freedom, I'll return it by working harder and longer. Especially if you don't have to do a very long commute. For some of us, maybe it's more than 2 hours a day, then you have that extra time to do extra work, right? On the other hand, it could be because employers now have a way to perhaps increase workloads without the confines of labor laws. If work was from 9 to 5, there are regulations that restrict you from making workers work longer, so restricting overtime. But if you give workers the autonomy and then put that in a target-setting performance outcome, performance-related pay, you could potentially increase the workload without actually being confined to these restrictions. But on the other hand, perhaps one of the other important aspects is that with this flexibility, people still tend to try to promote themselves as the ideal worker. Now, the ideal worker is what, could be considered what employers consider the most ideal of the worker types. The ideal worker is perpetually working, never gets sick, doesn't have any other interest or responsibility outside of work. Especially in our times where there is high levels of unemployment, increased competition, and when worker power and unions are in the decline, what we find that workers may need to promote themselves as ideal workers to survive in the workplace. So rather than using that autonomy to really increase their kind of life in other spheres of life, what the decreased boundaries happens is that it results in expansion of work, where workers work all the time and constantly. Now, this is really important to think about because, as I said, there's an increase in the propensity to work flexibly, and governments and employers are using this as a way of enhancing family friendliness while increasing productivity and performance outcomes. And we need to think about what that actually will mean for a lot of the workers in real terms. For more information about flexible working and its outcomes, please visit my website at www.wafproject.org, and thank you for listening.